She looked at me with a softness that cut through years of silence and whispered, "You remind me of your mother every day." I thought it was just a memory she clung to, until I realized what she truly saw when her eyes lingered on me. The first time I saw her again after so many years, I had to remind myself she was my aunt, not a stranger. Standing in the doorway of her countryside home, sunlight framed her like a quiet halo. She hadn't changed as much as I thought she would. If anything, time had only added a graceful steadiness to her presence. Her dark hair, now touched with faint strands of gold from the summer sun, fell loosely over her shoulders. I was 22, uncertain of myself, carrying the restless energy of someone who had yet to decide who he was meant to be. She, on the other hand, stood with the kind of confidence that only came with age, 34, a woman who had weathered storms and carried them with dignity. When she stepped closer, I caught the faintest trace of lavender, mixed with something warm, like old wood and polished books. She smiled, soft and almost shy, before drawing me into her arms. The hug was meant to be familial, I knew that, but it lingered in a way that surprised me. Her cheek brushed mine, her arms firm yet tender around my back, and for a moment I felt her heartbeat pressed faintly against my chest. I didn't know what to do with the sudden quiet rush in my chest. When she pulled back, her eyes stayed on me a little longer than expected. They weren't just looking at me, they were searching me, tracing something across my features that I couldn't name. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "You remind me of your mother every day." The word struck me deeper than I anticipated. My mother, her sister, had been gone for years, yet in that moment it felt as though the memory lived between us, suspended in the air. Her voice trembled faintly, and I couldn't tell if it was grief or something softer, something more difficult to confess. I shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond, but she saved me with a small smile, stepping aside and motioning me in. The house welcomed me with the warmth of familiarity. The wooden floors creaked gently under my shoes, and the air carried the faint smell of old photographs and fresh bread. Everything felt steeped in memory, yet alive with her presence. As I set down my bag, I caught her watching me again, her gaze both tender and unreadable. And though I told myself it was only because I reminded her of my mother, I couldn't ignore the way my skin still tingled where her hands had rested against my back. Later that afternoon, after I had settled in, she brought out a photo album. Its leather cover was worn smooth at the edges, the kind of book that had been opened and closed 1,000 times. She placed it between us on the couch, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. The cushion dipped beneath her weight, and I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her body, subtle but impossible to ignore. She flipped the first page carefully, as though even the paper held something fragile. Old photographs of family gatherings filled the page, the colors faded, the corners curling. She pointed at one with a smile, me as a child, sitting on the grass with cake smeared across my cheek. Her laugh, soft and genuine, rose in the quiet living room. It was a laugh that carried both lightness and sorrow, as though joy had become a rare thing she hadn't expected to find that day. Her hand lingered on the page, fingers tracing the outline of my mother's face in the picture. I watched the way her fingertips moved slowly, almost reverently, as if she could touch the memory itself. Then, without warning, her touch shifted to another photo, one where I stood beside my mother. She paused, her gaze flicking between the photo and me sitting beside her now. "You had the same eyes even then," she murmured. Her voice carried something more than observation, it carried longing. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled faintly, leaning in to get a closer look at the pictures. As I did, my knee brushed lightly against hers. I expected her to shift away, but she didn't. Instead, she left the small contact as it was, as though it belonged there. We kept turning the pages, laughter escaping in small bursts when she told me stories of my clumsy childhood, how I once tried to climb a tree and got stuck halfway, how I spilled juice on her favorite dress. The stories wove a thread between us, tugging me closer into her world. Every so often, I caught her watching me out of the corner of her eye, her expression unreadable. And when she smiled, it wasn't only because of the photographs, it was something else, something in the present moment. By the time we closed the album, the sun had begun to lower, spilling golden light through the curtains. The living room felt different, warmer somehow. I realized then that the photographs hadn't just brought back the past, they had drawn us into something new, something alive in the space between us. That evening, after dinner, she suggested we take a walk. The countryside had a way of settling into silence at dusk, the air cooling as though the world itself exhaled after the heat of the day. We stepped out into the gravel path that wound behind her house, the horizon still painted with streaks of gold and fading lavender. The first few minutes were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of stones beneath our shoes and the low chorus of crickets beginning their nightly song. She walked a little ahead at first, her skirt brushing against the long grass, but then she slowed, waiting for me to catch up. When I did, she slipped her arm through mine with a gentle, unthinking grace, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The touch startled me, not because it was bold, but because of how familiar it felt, how right. Her hand rested lightly against my forearm, her warmth seeping through the thin fabric of my shirt. I didn't pull away. If anything, I wanted the moment to last longer than the stretch of the path could allow. She pointed out small things as we walked, the fireflies beginning to glow faintly among the bushes, the call of an owl in the distance, the way the air smelled faintly of rain though the sky was clear. I found myself watching her more than the scenery. The soft curve of her smile, the way her hair caught the last strands of daylight, the steadiness in her stride, it was all quietly mesmerizing. After a while, her voice softened. "It gets lonely here sometimes," she said. "The house is full of memories, but memories don't keep you company." There was no self-pity in her tone, just quiet honesty. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I listened, letting her words settle. When I finally spoke, my voice came low, steady. "I'm here now." She looked up at me, her gaze holding mine for a heartbeat too long before drifting away. Her grip on my arm tightened slightly, as though she wanted to believe me, wanted to hold on to something solid. The path eventually led us to a small clearing where the grass swayed gently under the evening breeze. We stood there for a moment, saying nothing, the silence carrying its own kind of closeness. The fireflies drifted around us like small floating lanterns, and in that glow, with her hand still resting on my arm, I realized that the distance between us, years, names, expectations, had quietly begun to shrink. Later that night, after the walk, we settled at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of tea. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the soft hum of crickets outside the window. A single lamp glowed above us, casting a warm circle of light that seemed to close the world down to just the two of us. She sat across from me, her hands cupped around her mug. For a while, we spoke about small things, the weather, the garden, a book she had been reading, but beneath her words was a pause, a hesitation that felt heavy with something unsaid. I noticed how her gaze kept drifting toward me, only to pull away quickly, as if she was afraid of being caught. Finally, the silence stretched long enough that she let it break. Her eyes met mine, steady yet faintly trembling. "You've grown into the kind of man your mother would be proud of," she whispered. The words landed gently but carried an ache. My throat tightened, and I found myself searching her face for meaning beyond what she said. Her hand, almost without thought, slid across the table until it covered mine. The contact was soft, her palm warm against my skin, her fingers trembling slightly as they curled over the back of my hand. I froze, not from discomfort but from the rush of emotion that washed through me. The weight of her touch was more than affection, it was recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement of something that had been growing quietly between us since the moment I arrived. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The kitchen filled with silence, but it was not empty, it was charged, alive. I could hear the faint rattle of her breath, feel the steady beat of my own pulse quickening beneath her hand. When she finally pulled back, it was slow, reluctant, as though her heart fought against the motion. My hand felt strangely bare without hers, the warmth still lingering on my skin. She lifted her mug again, taking a sip as though nothing had happened, but her eyes betrayed her, shining too bright, holding too much. I wanted to speak, to say something that would meet the moment halfway, but my voice caught in my chest. All I managed was a quiet nod. Still, in that fragile exchange, something had shifted. The boundaries we had both held onto so carefully were no longer as firm. A door had been left slightly open, and neither of us seemed ready to close it. That night, lying in the small guest room, I found it impossible to sleep. The old house creaked softly as if it, too, was awake, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. I turned over again and again, my thoughts circling the same memory, the warmth of her hand resting over mine, the way her voice had broken just slightly when she spoke of my mother. I told myself it was nothing. A slip of emotion, nothing more. She was my aunt, she had known me since I was a child. And yet, as I stared at the ceiling in the dim light filtering through the curtains, I couldn't shake the way my chest had tightened when her touch lingered. It wasn't just memory or comfort. It was something alive, something present. The next morning, she moved through the kitchen with a deliberate calm, as though nothing had happened. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her sleeves rolled up as she worked at the counter. She smiled when I entered, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a quiet distance in the way she set the teapot down, in how she avoided brushing against me when she passed by. When I offered to help with the garden later, she agreed, but her manner was careful. She kept her hands busy, her words light, but there was an invisible thread of tension stretched between us. I caught myself watching her, how the sunlight slipped over her cheekbones, how her brow furrowed when she concentrated. She must have felt my gaze because she straightened suddenly, brushing dirt from her palms, and gave me a look that was almost pleading, "Don't." I tried to step back into safety, into simplicity. I made small jokes, tried to keep things light, and for a moment I thought it worked. She laughed, shaking her head at my clumsy attempts to handle the gardening tools. But then, as the breeze lifted, a strand of my hair fell across my forehead. Without thinking, she reached out, brushing it back with her fingers. The touch was quick, almost accidental, but it stole my breath. Her hand lingered just a fraction too long near my temple before she caught herself and drew back as though the air had burned her. We both froze, suspended in a silence neither of us dared to break. For the rest of the day, she busied herself with tasks, keeping a polite distance, and I followed her lead. But beneath the surface, I knew we were both struggling with the same truth, that our hearts kept betraying the restraint our minds demanded. The storm arrived suddenly, sweeping in with the heaviness of summer rain. One moment the sky was dim with clouds, the next, thunder rumbled across the fields and rain poured against the roof in steady sheets. She and I had just stepped out to gather laundry from the line when the downpour trapped us on the porch. We sat on the wooden steps, shoulders brushing, the air cool and damp. The world beyond blurred into silver streaks, the scent of wet earth rising sharp and clean. The rain drummed against the roof above us, a steady rhythm that seemed to quiet every thought except the ones we had been avoiding. For a long while, neither of us spoke. She pulled her shawl tighter around her, but when a cool breeze slipped through, I instinctively shifted closer. Our knees touched, tentative at first, then firmly when neither of us moved away. I could feel the warmth of her body even through the chill in the air, and it steadied something restless inside me. Her eyes stayed on the rain, but her voice came low, almost carried by the storm. Sometimes I wonder what people would say if they knew how close we've become. She paused, drawing in a breath that trembled. They'd call it strange, they'd misunderstand. And maybe they'd be right. I'm older. I should know better. Her honesty cut through me, not because it hurt, but because it revealed how deeply she was holding back. I turned toward her, studying the delicate lines of worry across her forehead, the way her lips pressed tight as though keeping more words trapped inside. "You've never had to be alone with me," I said softly. "You've given me nothing but warmth since I arrived. I don't care what anyone else thinks." At that, her eyes finally lifted to mine. There was fear in them, yes, but also something else, something vulnerable, raw, and longing. Her hand rested on her lap, trembling slightly. Without overthinking, I reached over and took it gently in mine. Her fingers stiffened for a moment, as if testing the weight of the choice, then softened. She let her hand stay there, small and warm within my grasp. We didn't move beyond that. We didn't need to. Her head tilted, resting lightly against my shoulder, her hair brushing my jaw. The storm hummed around us, but all I could feel was the stillness of her trust, the closeness she allowed me at last. And in that simple, quiet moment, the silence between us broke, not with grand words, but with the unspoken promise that we no longer needed to hide from what we both felt. The morning of my departure came sooner than I wanted. The house was quiet as I packed my bag, every sound amplified, the rustle of clothes, the soft click of the zipper. Each small noise felt like a reminder that my time here was ending, though the closeness we had found in these few days lingered in the air like something fragile, waiting to be acknowledged. She was already in the garden when I stepped outside, sunlight spilling over her shoulders. The roses were in bloom, their petals trembling faintly in the breeze, and she stood among them with her sleeves rolled back, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, and for a moment, she simply smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a host or the distant smile of an aunt, it was warmer, steadier, as though she had decided not to hide anymore. I joined her among the flowers, the grass damp beneath my shoes. Neither of us rushed to speak. The silence between us wasn't heavy now, it was calm, filled with all the words we didn't need to force into sentences. At last, I reached out, brushing gently at her cheek as if removing something that wasn't really there. My fingers lingered longer than they should have, the warmth of her skin delicate against my hand. She didn't move away. Instead, her breath caught softly, her eyes closing just for a heartbeat, as though memorizing the feeling. "You remind me of your mother," she whispered again, the words carrying a different weight now, less of grief and more of tenderness. Then, after a pause, she added, "But you're also entirely yourself. And that's who I want to remember." The truth of it settled over us like sunlight, warm and unhurried. I didn't need to answer with anything grand. Instead, I stepped closer, and she welcomed me into her arms. The embrace was steady, longer than any we had shared before. I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, strong and sure, as if it had finally found its rhythm again. When it came time to leave, we stood at the gate, the gravel path stretching away into the distance. She touched my arm one last time, her fingers squeezing gently before letting go. The gesture carried no promises, no declarations, only trust, and a quiet assurance that what we had discovered wasn't bound by the days we had shared, but by something deeper that would stay with us. As I walked away, I knew the distance between us was no longer defined by years or titles, but by a closeness that time itself could not undo.